I'm Indy Neidell, and this is Out of the Foxholes, where I sit in the general vicinity of my chair of infinite knowledge, which was off camera, but it's there, trust me. And I answer all your questions about World War II. Remember, Time Ghost Army members get prioritized or even guaranteed answers. Our first question comes from Army member Nick Macarius from our 1943 to 1944 tier. Nick asks us this. Time Ghost Army Brigadier Brent Sapp asked a question regarding the Allied Axis difficulties with supply and logistics in North Africa. I enjoyed the figures you outlined regarding the costs of railway construction, which is a subject I would like to ask about. My question is this. Throughout the series, we have heard about numerous shipping convoys attempting to supply the Soviet Union by the route to Arkhangelsk. However, the supply route less talked about on this series is the southern route. I once read an article explaining how the Allies constructed a railway network in both Iraq and Iran at lightning speed in order to keep supplying the Soviet Union. I'm waiting for the question. Would you and your research team expand on this interesting subject? We have talked about this. Not a whole lot less than about any convoys to the far north. Okay, and Spartacus, Spartacus has already touched on this particular topic in his episode about the Iranian famine. So you should look that up. Upon occupying the country, Iran, in August 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union commandeered the entire Iranian rail network and contracted half of Iran's private and public trucks. The years-long famine catalyzed by this has, by now in 1944, killed as many as 4 million Iranian civilians. But I'll take a closer look at the railway. Financed entirely with Iranian capital, the Trans-Iranian Railway was completed in 1934. It stretches 1,394 kilometers from Bandar Shahpur on the Persian Gulf to Bandar Shah on the Caspian Sea. Just to give you a scale of the engineering involved here, the route has 224 tunnels, making up 80 kilometers of the total track, which is a lot. It is a monumental feat of engineering, to be sure, but the Trans-Iranian Railway was kind of a white elephant for a while. See, to save money during construction, the line was built with lightweight steel rails, and those limit the weight and the speed of trains. Important branch lines, like the one to the port of Khorramshahr, well, they were never built in the first place. Fewer than 10 trains ran between Alwaz and Tehran a week. And even if the tracks were strong enough to carry more stuff, there wouldn't be the rolling stock to haul it with. In 1941, the State Railway of Iran operated fewer than 100 steam locomotives. And thanks to the outbreak of the war in 1939, the German firms that built the locomotive stopped taking Iranian orders. Upon occupation, the railway was split in two. The British operate the section from the Persian Gulf to Tehran, at which point the Soviets take over and manage the section running to the Caspian. By 1942, the British improved their section of the railway quite a bit, completing that line to Khorramshahr, bringing over locomotives from Britain, and importing and regauging a few freight cars from India. However, railway capacity was not increasing nearly as fast as the flow of Lend-Lease aid was. So shiploads of war material that should have been thrown at the Germans on the Eastern Front, they were just sitting in warehouses on the Persian Gulf. This crisis quickly reached the attention of the highest levels of Allied command. Winston Churchill himself decided to turn over operation of the British sector of the railway to the Americans following the Moscow Conference of 1942. But requests that the Americans be allowed to operate the whole line were rebuffed by the Soviets. Under Major General Donald H. Connolly, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers rapidly improved the line. New diesel locomotives eliminated the need for coal shoveling and for water stops. There is now stronger track, miles of copper wire for a new signaling system, and thousands upon thousands of freight cars along the line. By January 1943, railway operating battalions, staffed by experienced American railroaders, were running trains between Tehran and the Persian Gulf. Soviet railroaders, trainmen, engineers, whatever you want to call them, also picked up the pace from Tehran northward. And by now in 1944, a railway that was once able to carry like 500 tons of supplies a day is now carrying 11,000, and that total is only increasing. This one comes from Mark Strauss. What was the method route for delivering care packages, Red Cross packages to U.S. prisoners of war? I presume they went through Swiss or Swedish intermediaries. How many of them were pilfered, if any? It must have been a great temptation. Well, unlike all that war material sitting in Persian Gulf warehouses, you're certainly on the right track. Sorry, I'll get my coat. Aid to most American POWs is collected first by national Red Cross societies around the world before the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva takes over shipping throughout Europe. International law dictates certain obligations states have towards captives, but these packages ensure POWs are kept in good health and high spirits without relying entirely on the goodwill of their captors, right? They contain food, clothing, medical supplies, but, they also have like books and games and even musical instruments. The Red Cross also forwards packages and messages family and friends back home have provided for individual prisoners. Most shipments enter the continent via Lisbon, with some also going to Gothenburg. From Lisbon, goods go around the Mediterranean to Marseille and Genoa. From Gothenburg, then they go to Lübeck. All of it heads to Geneva for distribution to the camps. These journeys, though, are anything but easy. Neutral shipping to charter is in short supply, and the sea journey is obviously hazardous. The International Committee must also get each shipment certified by the Allied authorities and provide journey information to both sides in advance. And as for the land journey, there are never enough trains, train cars, and fighting and bombing wrecks infrastructure everywhere. POWs also pretty consistently get relocated further from the front lines as, for example, the Allies continue their advance into Europe here in 1944. Now, the second part of your question. This sort of disruption does provide excellent opportunities for aid being, shall we say, misappropriated. At this point in 1944, that's mostly civilians trying to supplement what is available to them in wartime, right? And a bunch of Red Cross supplies are ending up on the black market. Now, we don't know exactly how much aid is being lost like this, but it is definitely a minority, okay? The Red Cross supervises aid transport at all stages along its journey and collects receipts upon delivery, so we know most of it arrives at its destination. And in Europe, it's really in Germany's interest to allow aid to reach Allied prisoners of war because it somewhat safeguards the treatment of their own prisoners in Allied custody. But what about the Pacific? Well, things are much more complex there, as you may have suspected. Japan's cooperation with the International Committee is pretty limited. Japan doesn't even tell them about half its POW camps, and it only recognizes committee delegates working in the home islands, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, which excludes most of Japan's current empire. Perhaps the bigger problem in delivering aid is that Japan doesn't even allow neutral ships to enter its territory. A couple of workarounds have been found. Some 152,000 packages will make it on Japanese ships transporting diplomats and civilians to and from Portuguese Mozambique between July 1942 and the end of this year. The USSR has also allowed the Red Cross to stockpile aid in Vladivostok. Only one collection will eventually be made by the Japanese from that store, though, in November 1944. Looking ahead, and spoiler alert, in April 1945, a Japanese ship returning from delivering Red Cross aid to Singapore will be sunk by an American submarine. This, despite carrying Red Cross markings and supposedly enjoying safe passage. The result will be Japan ceasing what meager cooperation they have given in distributing Red Cross aid. 226,145 parcels for POWs and civilian internees will have been delivered to Japan by the war's end, compared with millions delivered to Europe. Without the Red Cross fully supervising distribution, we also don't know how much of that actually gets to the Allied prisoners. So while American POWs in Europe could generally count on regular gifts from home to, keep them going, those in the Far East were not so lucky. Time Ghost Army Private Christopher Persampieri writes on Patreon, many ground support planes like the Ju-87s and IL-2s had a rear gunner in them. How useful were they in actual combat? Okay. That's a great question. Because the rear gunner seats, the tail gunners, would pretty much completely disappear from aircraft design after the war. That has more to do with changing technology, though, than a reflection of their wartime effectiveness. Speaking of technology, I used to love the arcade game Tail Gunner back in like 1980 when it came out, when the arcade game Explosion was still really popping, when I was like 12, 13. Tail Gunner was really good. You guys should Google it. It was really simple, but it was really fun. You were the tail gunner, and you'd have little waves of 3 planes that you'd have to shoot. And it was one of the first games with vector graphics, which all the kids thought was really super cool. Yeah, the things you learn here on Out of the Foxholes. Space Fury was the first arcade game with color vector graphics, and that was in like 1981 or 82. And then Tempest was the most popular and the best of all of the vector graphic games back then. Tempest was awesome. I have a story about a blister on my finger from Tempest, but I'm not going to tell you because it takes too long. But anyhow, Tail Gunner, that's what we're talking about. Tail Gunner had a really weird control. Normally you have a joystick, right? It had fire buttons, but you have a joystick. It had a shield and a fire button. But it had a tiny little, almost like an elongated metal toothpick, just like this. So you could really, it had a little more play than a regular joystick. Can we get a photo? There you go. Tail Gunner. Super fun game. Okay, rear gunners. Sorry about that, guys. Although there are notable exceptions like the Bolton Paul Defiant and the Blackburn Rock of the RAF, which have heavily armed turrets as their only weaponry and are designed as bomber hunters or night fighters. The primary purpose of turret gunners is in almost all cases self-defense. Thus, the effectiveness of these turrets is less about how many planes they shoot down and more about how many times the gunner's own plane does not get shot down, which is a hard thing to measure because you can't really know how many times something didn't happen, right? But even though their efficiency, might be difficult to measure with any degree of statistical accuracy, plenty of crews will share stories after the war of how the rear gunners, the tail gunners, got them home alive. Some of you might remember an aerial skirmish back in 1942 over Guadalcanal when the famous Japanese fighter ace Saburo Sakai was nearly killed when he misidentified some US dive bombers as single-seat fighters. He got hit very badly by an almost lethal burst of fire from one of the tail gunners, and he barely survived. There's also plenty of American gunners who've talked about scaring enemy fighters off their tail by just spraying bullets in their general direction, regardless of whether they, scored a hit or not. Gunner Mel Clark, in the back of his SBD Dauntless over Rabaul, had both of his guns jammed right before a Japanese Zero appeared on his tail. But all he had to do was swing the malfunctioning guns in the enemy pilot's direction, and that was enough to scare him off. Also, keep in mind, the gunner isn't just an extra gun, he's an extra set of eyes. In all cases, one of the most useful things the rear gunner does in combat is to keep the pilot aware of what's going on behind him so he can make proper maneuvers to keep the enemy from getting on their tail in the first place. But you asked about the Soviet IL-2 and the German Ju-87, so I should at least say something about at least one of them specifically. Okay, well, here's some stuff, right? The IL-2 Sturmovik is actually a great example here because it was initially designed without a rear gunner. But after it suffered heavy losses to enemy fighters early in the war, the Soviet engineers decided to add one, and it turned the plane into a really deadly machine. So much so that, somewhat ironically for the question, the heavily armed and armored IL-2 has ended up becoming a top predator of the German Ju-87 Stukas, whose small caliber rear guns can't do much against their heavy armor. Although, to be fair, the Stuka is fairly outdated by 1944. And is often outmatched in the skies by most current Allied aircraft. But that doesn't mean the Stukas are defenseless against all foes. There's also evidence to indicate that back in March of this year, one of the leading Soviet aces of the war, Lev Shostakov, was killed when he got too close to a Stuka's rear gunner. Not only that, and there's another minor spoiler here, next February, one of the top-scoring German fighter aces, Otto Kettel, will be killed by the rear gunner of an IL-2. So you can see that the gunners could indeed be lethal even to experienced pilots. That, in addition to the other practicalities I mentioned earlier, means it could be reasonably argued that the gunners were fairly effective in actual combat, especially when you remember their main job was to get themselves and their plane home in one piece. And that concludes this installment of Out of the Foxholes. If you want to learn more about the Iranian famine, a piece of history that's really been quite overlooked in the whole story of the war, you can click here for Sparty's special episode on that any second now. If you're wondering why I'm sweating, it's because it's very, very hot here. It's like 32 degrees or something, yeah? Yeah, it's ridiculous. Pretty much. And if you have a question, you can ask us at community.timegoes.tv, or better yet, join us at Patreon. Patrons at Patreon get priority, and those with the rank of captain and above get a guaranteed answer to their question. If you are generous enough to join at the highest level, the brigadier level, you get access to a private WhatsApp group with all of us here at Time Ghost, and after 12 months, you can dedicate a video memorial to someone who experienced World War II. So, leave your questions there, or send them to us on Patreon. But you know what? Where you should, but you know where you should not leave them. You should not leave them in the comment section under this video. Or you can, but we're not gonna answer them. We are not going to pick them. If you say, "Well, how come this happened?" Ask it where we told you to ask it. Now, James, picture of James, we've taken over the job of going through those from Frankie, picture Francis, Frankie. And James loves reading your questions, but if you leave them under the video, he will not answer them. So make sure he has something to do. Make James's picture a little bigger, and make Frankie's a little smaller, sort of like Frankie's fading away, and James is becoming something bigger, yeah? All right, well, keep sending those questions at Patreon or at the website, and I will see you next time.